to invite everyone to please rise and join us in the singing of the Philippine National Anthem, which will be immediately followed by our prayer.
Sa simula, sa langit ng baha, may nilagang tula at tawid sa paglayang minamahal. Ang kisag ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na namimingin, ang bituin at araw ng kailan pa may magdidinig. Lupa ng araw at ipagsinta, wala langit sa piling mo. Ang ligaya
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this year's
Kagitingan Historical Webinar Lectures 2022, a Filipino perspective of heroism and valor.
I am Felicia Loislania.
I am Maga Grace Sahabun.
And I am Hannah Costas, and we are your hosts for today.
Now, before anything else, allow me to acknowledge the presence of the following: Department of National Defense Secretary Delphine N. Lorenzana, PIVAW Administrator Yusek Ernesto G. Carolina, PIVAW Deputy Administrator Asik Raul Z. Caballes, NHCP Chairperson Dr. Rene R. Escalante, and PVB Vice President Mr. Mike Villarreal.
Mount Samat FTES Administrator Mr. Francis Inetorio, DFP President Dr. Cesar P. Pobre, Dr. Archie B. Resos from the University of Santo Tomas, Dr. Jose Romel B. Hernandez from De La Salle University, and Dr. Marilyn R. Ngales from the Lyceum of the Philippines, University, Manila.
Also, we would like to extend our gratitude to the following institutions for partnering with us in this webinar series: Armed Forces of the Philippines OK3, Department of Education, Commission on Higher Education, Department of Tourism, National Commission for Culture and the Arts, National Youth Commission,
National Historical Commission of the Philippines, Veterans Federation of the Philippines, Philippine Information Agency, Girl Scouts of the Philippines, Boy Scouts of the Philippines, Filipino American Memorial Endowment, and Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor Incorporated.
Right about now, we have 58 participants here in Zoom. Now, for those who are unable to pre-register, we are currently being broadcasted via Facebook Live on the official Facebook page of the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office.
Before we officially begin the program, here are some reminders for all of us. In case there are lags, just stay on and wait for it to load again. Zoom attendees are on mute to avoid background noise. If you have questions, you may use the message box for Zoom attendees or use the comment section on the Facebook live stream. After the webinar, the participants who registered in this webinar are encouraged to answer the evaluation form. The link will be sent on their email.
During our last episode, we were joined by our four resource speakers. First by Dr. Marcelino Macapinlac Jr., who presented his paper entitled The Santo Tomas Internment Camp in Digital Resources, followed by Mr. Jose Matthew P. Luga, who gave us the history of the Benguet during the Second World War. Another lecture about the little-known story, Muntinlupa during the war, was given by Mr. Michael Angelo Tabuyan.
And during our afternoon session, Dr. Kirby C. Alvarez discussed and highlighted the important events that took place in Malabon during the World War II, while Mr. Jose Alberto L. Jimenez III gave his lecture about the local history of Calamba from 1942 to 1945. And lastly, Mr. Ruben Jeffrey A. Asuncion shared his historical notes on Novaliches and North Caloocan during the Second World War.
For those of you who wish to watch the previous episode of our webinar series, the recorded lectures may still be viewed at the official Facebook page and YouTube account of the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office.
This last episode of this webinar series will be dedicated to the growing discussion about the aftermath of the war and the continuing legacy of the veterans who exemplified their heroism and the love for the country during the war.
And with that, our lineup of resource speakers for this morning's session include Dr. Ricardo Torrejose, who will be presenting his lecture examining the historiography of the Second World War in the Philippines. Meanwhile, Dr. Jose Victor de Sena Jimenez will be giving us will be talking about the Philippine Constabulary Band, and another lecture about the history of the defenders of Bataan and Corregidor Incorporated will be discussed by General Enrique B. Galang.
And for our afternoon session, we will be welcoming Mr. Mark Anthony S. Angeles, who will share to us the importance of creative Filipino writers during the war. Lastly, Mr. Vicente Lim IV will share his historical notes on Novaliches and North Caloocan during the Second World War.
So without further ado, let us begin our program with an opening message from the Mount Samat Flagship Tourism Enterprise Zone Administrator, Mr. Francis Theodore P. Initorio.
Our partners and lead organizers of this Kagitingan webinar series, the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office, the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, and the Philippine Veterans Bank, as well as the educational institutions, academicians, and today's speakers, a pleasant day to all. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome all of you, especially our participants, students and researchers, in the series finale of this year's Kagitingan Historical Webinar Lectures. We are very glad to note the fruitful discussions that have advanced knowledge among the webinar series participants over the past 3 months. As we end the Kagitingan series with the topic on the Filipino Veterans Historic Legacy, we hope that our avid learners will help our government agencies, especially PVAL, to promote nationalism and patriotism, which are the core values that we seek to enhance through these information seminars. During the opening of the Kagitingan series, we emphasize our goal to help our youth not only recount the stories of the past, but also ignite in everyone a sense of willingness to partake in promoting the heroism of our veterans and instill in us the values of patriotism and selfless service. As I mentioned during my past messages, the Mount Samat Flagship Tourism Enterprise Zone, as one of the supporters and partners of PVAL, is confident that these learning sessions help us visit and revisit our history of patriotism and valor and build and rebuild our love of country. Before we proceed with the seminar, let me congratulate anew PVAL and all the partner institutions, the University of Santo Tomas, the University of the Philippines, De La Salle University, and the Polytechnic University of the Philippines for the successful conduct of this year's 3-month informative sessions. Thank you for leading the discussions. I commend your commitment to this event. Without further ado, let me turn over the virtual mic to our speakers today, Dr. Jose, Dr. Jimenez, Dr. Galang, Mr. Angeles, and Mr. Lim IV. Just like my previous messages, let me leave a valuable quote. Our goal is to remember. Our goal is to preserve and honor. Again, congratulations to everyone. Let us all enjoy the series finale. A pleasant day to all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ernatorio, for your welcoming message.
This time, we will be joined by Philippine Veterans Bank Vice President for Corporate Communications and Marketing Services Department, Mr. Miguel Villarreal, to deliver his message.
Magandang umaga po. It is my part of the closing remarks here in the last Kagitingan webinar episode for 2022. I am Mike Villarreal and I am the Head of Marketing and Communications at Philippine Veterans Bank, but also the Executive Vice President of the National VFP Sons and Daughters Association Incorporated. On behalf of our Chairman, Bobby D. Ocampo, and our President, Toto Claraval, who are also both descendants of World War II veterans, we would like to thank PVAL for allowing Philippine Veterans Bank to be your partner in this wonderful webinar series. I also want to thank our speakers, Dr. Ricardo Torrejose, Dr. Jose Victor Decena Jimenez, and Mr. Mark Anthony Angeles. It has always been a privilege to learn from you and your insights on what you have been studying and researching in these past few months. We in Philippine Veterans Bank believe that the veterans' example and their legacy should always be studied, researched, shared, and more importantly, emulated. In my many years of being here at Veterans Bank, since almost 2 decades ago, it has been a privilege to talk, listen, converse, and engage some of the World War II veterans when many of them were still alive. And I firmly believe that we have a lot of lessons to learn from them. And it is my sincere hope that through this webinar series, our participants can not just learn lessons, but also apply it in your own lives. Yun lang po. Thank you to all the participants who joined us in this last webinar episode and also to those in the previous webinar episodes. Magandang umaga muli at maraming salamat.
Thank you very much, Mr. Villarreal, for your message.
First in line of our speakers for today is a history professor from the University of the Philippines, Dr. Ricardo
Recording in
Torrejose.
progress.
Ricardo Torrejose is a professor of history at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He obtained his bachelor's and master's degree in history at UP and his PhD from the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. He specializes in military and diplomatic history with focus on the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. He published widely in various journals and books. Among his major publications are the Philippine Army, 1935 to 1942, Ateneo de Manila University Press, 1992, and Volume 7 on the Japanese occupation of the Philippines of the multi-volume Kasaysayan set, Reader's Digest, 1998. He was awarded the Metro Bank Foundation Outstanding Filipino in Teaching in 2019. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ricardo Torrejose.
Morning, everyone, and I hope everyone is doing well this morning. It is May, and it's getting quite warm. This is really the hottest part of the year. But anyway, What we are commemorating this year is the 80th anniversary of World War II, in particular the 80th anniversary of the fall of Bataan, 80th anniversary of the fall of Corregidor, but also the 80th anniversary of the formation of many guerrilla groups. So all that happened in 1942, 80 years ago. So since the time that World War II occurred, there were many books written about the war, published in the Philippines, published in the United States, published in Japan, published elsewhere in other countries as well. So I will try to collapse the whole, all of what has come out in the last 80 years or so, highlighting certain trends and giving attention to some of the most important works, those that set trends and those that I think are books that other people, that everyone studying World War II should know. I'm excluding from this presentation articles that were published in journals or periodicals. There are too many of these, but there are several that are important. I'm also excluding most of those that were written as theses or dissertations. I'm also excluding those books that focused mainly on the Americans in the Philippines. So I'll be focusing more on the Philippine experience during World War II and the Japanese occupation. Now, when the war ended in 1945, there were many works that were published very quickly after the war. In fact, during the war itself, there were several works that were published in the United States that were used to prop up the morale of the American fighting men, to tell the American public what was going on in the war. And those were some of the first books that came to the Philippines right after the war. Things like They Were Expendable, about the American PT boats, or the Diaz story, which was one of the first books on the Death March, and so forth. But again, the focus was largely on the American experience: prisoners of war, the Death March, guerrillas, Americans who were interned in Santo Tomas. Insofar as the guerrillas were concerned, they were really mainly stories of Americans who were with the guerrillas. So the Philippine side was not very evident in the first books that came out in the United States. There was occasional reference to them, how they helped the people marching the Death March and so forth, but very little from the Filipino point of view. So the 1940s to the early 1950s would see our first generation of works relating to World War II. From the Philippine side, the first works were actually on the guerrillas, the massacres, and so forth. And many of the accounts were focused largely on Manila. So they were, in many cases, very general accounts. One reason for this was still so close to the war. So much was considered general knowledge. It was felt that everybody knew about this. This was only 3, 4, 5 years after the war. Everybody knew about this. It was common knowledge. So it was not even considered history by many. So it was not taken very seriously. So people wrote about their experiences to dramatize what had happened, to tell people how courageous people were, also to focus on the suffering of people during the massacres. So one work that stood out at this point was the Lichauco Diary, or the Diary of Marshal Lichauco, which was a day-to-day account from December 8, 1941 till the end of the Battle of Manila, which was the first actual written record by a Filipino of the Japanese occupation, written contemporaneously with the events. That's in English. There's an even rarer work that is very hard to find, written in Tagalog. And that is a work that has not fully been tapped even today. There was an academic work. There was Rafaelita Hilario Soriano's dissertation on propaganda during the Japanese occupation. That was a dissertation in the US, and that was not made available in the Philippines until much later. Still, at that time, it was a pioneering work because it used primary documents that were available in the US and not available in the Philippines. There were early academic works also, as early as the late 1940s and the early 1950s, on the guerrilla resistance movement in the Visayas and Mindanao, education during the Japanese occupation. Most of these were really trying to establish fact. And since they were generally common knowledge at that time, then these were trying to put on paper what almost everybody knew. The documentation was very scarce at that time. There was very little material that was really available to use as primary documentation. Later in the 1940s and particularly in the 1950s, the official histories would emerge. Official histories of the United States, official histories of the Australians, of the British. These would come out in the 1950s particularly. And even the armed forces of the Philippines would try to come out with its own unit histories. There was one divisional history of the first regular division that was published, but that is very hard to find today. So these were, in essence, while they were supposed to be official histories, they were military histories. They were very specific. In the case of the US Army and US Navy histories, they were very competent. They were written by professional historians, and they used a lot of primary material that was available at that time. In the case of the armed forces of the Philippines, people were still very much alive, and some of them had documents that they could share. But again, what was published here tended to be only for limited distribution and did not really reach mass consumption. Again, all of this was so close to the war, and much of this was really considered general knowledge. There was very little actual interest in reading about the horrors of war and the difficulties of war at this time. There was a general lack of primary sources because many of the sources were still classified. They would not be classified until about 10 or 20 or even 50 years after the fact. So of the early publications, the American works that would have very strong impact on our historiography, on how we perceive the war, would be first-hand accounts by Americans, such as that by General Wainwright. General Wainwright's story would become the landmark history of Bataan and Corregidor. And no one would dare to criticize this because he was the head, he was the chief of the United States forces in the Philippines when Corregidor fell. Then there was Guerrilla Padre in Mindanao, which was a classic story of a Jesuit who became a chaplain in the guerrilla forces in Mindanao. That became so popular that it was actually reprinted in the Philippines. There was a local printing in the 1960s. Then there was American Guerrilla in the Philippines, which was one of several books by Americans who participated in the guerrilla resistance. And this became such a bestseller that it was made into a movie by Hollywood in the 1950s. But again, these were essentially American accounts of what happened in the Philippines, and the Filipinos played a secondary role or a supporting role. So looking at it from a different perspective, looking at it what people outside of the United States were writing, perhaps the most significant work in Tagalog then and even now was Nang Magdaan ang Daluyong by Faustino Aguilar, very famous writer even at that time. And he published his diary of the occupation, not so much in Manila, but in the outskirts of Manila, in San Juan and later on further out of Manila. This dramatized the barbarities of the Japanese, the difficulties of life, horrors, and so forth. And then in Spanish, so this showed that other people were also interested in the Philippines. Just after the war, a Spanish writer, journalist, Perez de Olaguer, came to the Philippines to interview particularly the Spaniards who had survived the Battle of Manila. And he published this as the first real detailed account of what happened in the Battle of Manila. Then from the Filipino veterans' point of view, very soon after the war, there was this very small pamphlet, it was a thin book that was called The Voice of the Veteran, which was edited by Manuel Buenafe, which contained literary works, parts of memoirs, and even poems by Filipino guerrillas covering the battlefront, Bataan, Corregidor, life under the Japanese, the Death March, and also the guerrilla resistance movement. So this was really the first, and it's one of the most important books to try to tell the war from a Filipino veteran's perspective. As the official histories began to come out, on the left side, we see the US Navy semi-official history. It wound up to become 15 volumes, of which the Philippine-related volumes were very quickly 3 or 4. And then in the center, we have the US Army histories, which were official histories checked by generals, by veterans, and so forth. And they became the most important works to rely on. And we still rely on many of them for the fall of the Philippines, for example. That's still a classic work. Most of them are now available online, and you can download them very freely. And the most classic diary by a Filipino who was in Manila, who documented the war as it happened, was the diary called Dear Mother Putnam by Marshal P. Lichauco. This was a very important diary published around 1949, but was mainly forgotten because it was not well circulated. It was not a bestseller. But later on, the family reprinted it, and it is one of the more available diaries today. Very important because it gives the perspective of a Filipino father living in Manila during the height of the war. And then by the 1950s, you would have other personal accounts talking about Japanese atrocities. The one on the left, Blood on the Rising Sun, is by a war widow. Her husband was arrested by the Japanese and tortured in Fort Santiago. In the center, we have a classic guerrilla memoir by Yai Panlilio called The Crucible. She was involved with Marking's guerrillas, and she was a journalist before the war, very fluent in English, and this became a very well-known book in the United States, and in the Philippines, it also became a bestseller, but because it was very literary in style, it was not generally used by historians. What was more important to those who wanted to study the war in general were general accounts like A Day to Remember by Eliseo Quirino, the brother of the president, Elpidio Quirino. And this tried to compress in one volume the whole war experience. But the perspective was basically from the perspective of one who was in Manila. So again, many of the accounts were considered general knowledge, although there was a bibliography here. It was very, very basic. By the 1960s, you were now 20 years moved away from the war. So there was, with that distance, you would have members of the academe trying to look into the war in more, from a more distanced perspective. And it's at this time that the classic work on the Japanese occupation in World War II, Teodoro Agoncillo's The Fateful Years, comes out. And this becomes the first documented historical study combined with the author's own personal information, personal experiences. And it's still a very important work today because it combines in the two volumes essentially the whole of the occupation. The guerrillas, the government in exile, Bataan and Corregidor, and life in occupied Philippines. About the same time that Agoncillo's Fateful Years came out, the two volumes of Hartendorp, called The Japanese Occupation of the Philippines, came out. This was essentially a record written inside Santo Tomas internment camp, and that documented the news as he heard it at the time. It's a very important work, although it is not historical in the same sense that Agoncillo's work is, because this was written at the time it happened. It consisted of stories that were heard from people coming into the camp, stories that were written in the newspapers and so forth. But now that you were 25 years away from the war, it was also time to bring out documents on the Japanese occupation, not simply relying on oral histories and so forth, but now looking into primary documentation. And Mauro P. Garcia, who was the librarian in Malacanang at that time, was able to compile several volumes, several issues of the historical bulletin with very important documents on the Japanese occupation. They are still rather unused today, but these are the most basic cabinet meetings, the reports of different offices, and so forth. At this time, also, again, 25 years after the war, you now have some distance from the war, so you have more thorough histories on the guerrillas, not just personal accounts, but now combined works of using personal memoirs, but also talking of using available materials. So Colonel Uldarico Boclagon wrote probably the first overall history of all the guerrillas in the Philippines based on available documentation on that time. Colonel Pobre, Cesar Pobre, did his MA thesis on the Northern Luzon guerrillas, so it brought it to a very academic level. And then you would have Proculo Mojica, who was a veteran himself, compiling a history of the Hunters ROTC guerrillas. So these were all written by people who had experienced the war, and so therefore could write about it firsthand, but decided to use other narratives, either from their friends or written materials that were available at that time. A very important work that came out in the 1960s also was the publication of Jose P. Laurel's War Memoirs. This brought out for the first time the perspective of the President of the Second Republic, who had been vilified and as a collaborator and so forth. And this brought out the different problems that he actually faced. And this being 20, 25 years after the war, it was now becoming the subject of academic discourse, academic study, not just in the Philippines, but especially in the United States. And so we see three important books coming out in the 1960s. Theodore Friends Between Two Empires, where he looks at the Japanese occupation as the closing period of this very dramatic period, the last part of the American period and the Commonwealth, and finally the Japanese occupation. And then you have Steinberg with his Philippine collaboration in World War II. The first time you would actually have a scholarly attempt to analyze what happened, why certain people collaborated and why certain people did not. And there was Stanley Falk's Bataan, the March of Death, where he looked into the death march in detail, using testimonies that came out in the war crimes trials. So scholarship was coming out, and these books would become very important, and they still are very important in the analysis of World War II in the Philippines and the Japanese occupation. Then another landmark book published in the United States in the 1960s was John Toland's But Not in Shame, which was very important because it brought to the American public not just the American experience of the Bataan campaign. Well, this was the whole first 6 months of the war, Pearl Harbor, the fall of Malaya and Singapore, and of course the fall of the Philippines received a lot of attention here, all the way till the Battle of Midway in 1942. But what was important in But Not in Shame was John Toland came to the Philippines, interviewed Filipino survivors and veterans, and he also went to Japan and interviewed Japanese as well. So this is the first time that a historian, a popular historian, tries to bring the war from the perspective of different points of view: British, Australian, American, Filipino, and especially for the Philippine side. This work is something that has not fully been tapped, and it's something that is well worth examining even today. So these are the covers of the different books that I mentioned: The Fateful Years by Agoncillo, Hartendorf's Japanese Occupation of the Philippines, Bataan by Stanley Falk, David Joel Steinberg's Philippine Collaboration in World War II. And in the center bottom is the cover of Mauro P. Garcia's first volume, the documents on the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, and you would have the war memoirs of Jose P. Laurel. So these are all still very important works. The Fateful Years is so important that the UP Press reprinted it as part of its 100 years of the Philippine Republic anniversary. Hartendorf is very difficult to find at this point. It's a rare book now. Falk's book on Bataan has been reprinted several times. Steinberg's work was so important, it was reprinted in the Philippines. Garcia's compilation of documents is so important, but very few people have actually fully used it. And Laurel's War Memoirs has been reprinted many times, particularly by by the Lyceum University. Now, for the guerrilla resistance movement, the first overall attempt to cover the whole resistance movement was Colonel Baclagon's book on the left, and then you would have Proculo Mojica's very definitive book on the Hunters ROTC, and on the right side we see John Toland's landmark work, But Not in Shame. And by this time also, the Philippine Army, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, was still trying to continue its histories of the various divisions, but it lacked money. And so the veterans organizations would try to put some of them out, such as this, which came out around 1967 on the 25th anniversary of Bataan. So this had been written in the 1950s, but there was no money to publish it. So the second regular division veterans would come up and raise money to publish this. By the 1970s, you had more areas that were being covered, but they were limited because this was the period of martial law. So insofar as theses that were printed, or rather theses that were submitted to the University of the Philippines, among others, you would have guerrilla resistance movements being examined outside of Luzon, looking more specifically at places that had not fully received attention, such as Sulu and Panay, and looking at it through different lenses, the use of oral histories, available primary sources, and looking at particular issues, such as the struggle between civil government and the military in Panay. There would be, for perhaps the first book that came out in the martial law years that dealt with World War II, was an important personal account, a diary by a Filipino who was arrested by the Japanese and brought to Fort Santiago and eventually brought to Muntinlupa, in prison there. This was Men and Memories in Confinement, the first time that you had very detailed account, a very detailed diary of his experience as a political prisoner, as a subject of the Japanese torture and so forth. And since the guerrillas were very much alive, they were now in their prime, there was an attempt to come up with more definitive works. And the most definitive account of the Panay guerrillas was a work that was commissioned by the 6th Military District Guerrillas, and that was Gamaliel Manikan, who came up with a very thick account of the guerrilla resistance movement in Panay. By the late 1960s and the 1970s, we also had enough distance from the war that some Japanese accounts were being translated from Japanese to English, and so we were also beginning to get a bit of the Japanese perspective. So by the 1960s and the 1970s, we were moving towards more normal relations between the Philippines and Japan. So these early Japanese works contributed to helping the Filipino understand the Japanese point of view. Then in the 1970s, there would be another important book that would come out. This would be Renato Constantino's The Continuing Past, which looked into the American period and the Japanese occupation, interpreting that period now through an ideological perspective, rather than simply putting out the facts. He tried to interpret it using class interests, imperialism, and so forth. So he highlighted the role of the Hukbalahap, people's movements, and so forth. It didn't really present very much that was new in terms of fact, but the interpretation was quite interesting because it was the first time that this particular ideology, that this particular perspective was brought out. So this is the cover of Men and Memories in Confinement. It came out very early in martial law, just a month or two after the martial law had been declared, and therefore it even had to get permission to be published. But it became a very important first-person account of those people who were imprisoned by the Japanese. And it also contained the names and addresses and messages of those who were imprisoned with Agustin. On the left side here, we see Guerrilla Warfare on Panay Island, which was commissioned by the 6th Military District Veterans. It's a very thick, it's a very heavy book. And at the same time, you would also have a brief history of the Bulacan military area, which was written by a poet from Bulacan. And also about the same time, we have this book on Palawan by Diokno Manlavi, Palawans Fighting 1000. And to wrap it up, there was also a book on the Cebu guerrillas. So we were moving outside of Luzon, and we now have these other books that were talking about the other island guerrillas, which had not received very much attention in most of the earlier works. For the Japanese works coming out at this point, the two important works in English were No Requiem by Tadashi Moriya, who was in the mountains east of Laguna, and Tetsuro Ogawa's Terraced Hell. He was up in the Banawe area where he suffered very greatly. These were Japanese accounts, but both of these were actually more accounts of civilians who were attached to the Japanese. Moriya was a medical doctor and Ogawa was a teacher. So we still lacked the voice of the Japanese soldier himself. So these were professionals who had been drafted and came to the Philippines not particularly to fight, but to do other work while here. So by the 1980s, we were now 40 years after the war. So for those in the academe, it gave more time to study the impact of the war, its role in Philippine history. And Alfred McCoy would come up with a theory that challenged the earlier understanding of the war. Most people up to the 1980s felt that World War II was a turning point. It was something that was very important in Philippine history. It was something that was unforgettable. It was a watershed. And this was similar to other accounts in Southeast Asia as well. But when Al McCoy studied the case of Panay in particular, he found out that rather than being a turning point, it seemed that this was only a temporary glitch. And after the war, you would have the same political families, whether they were tainted with collaboration or not, continuing on in power. And so you would have McCoy coming up with what he called the continuity theory, that the war itself did not bring very much change insofar as social classes were concerned, insofar as political power. That is still a point that we argue even today. Was it discontinuity? Was it a watershed? Or was it really more continuity? And another aspect of analysis was given by Theodore Friend, who had earlier written Between Two Empires. This time he would publish a book called The Blue-Eyed Enemy, which was interesting because he now compared the Philippine experience with the experience of Indonesia, thus making it easy to spot differences and similarities between the experiences between the two. Up to the present time, there is no region-wide study that we have access to that compares all of them. There have been several general accounts that have come out since, but Friend's account was the first time that you tried to compare two countries' experiences. Teodoro Agoncillo would come out with another book, which also was a landmark work insofar as the collaboration question was concerned. He would look into the collaboration cases of Laurel and Jorge B. Vargas. And that book was entitled The Burden of Proof. So here he looks more favorably at Laurel and Vargas, that they were kind of prisoners of history, that they had no other choice at that particular point in time. So it was unfair to call them collaborators or puppets because in the case of Laurel, for example, Laurel was able to exhibit his nationalism more strongly under the Japanese. Vargas was kind of a prisoner of the Japanese and could not do very much. As part of this re-examination also, you would have more critical views of the guerrillas coming out, such as the very rare book now, Bad Guerrillas in Northern Luzon, which was actually suppressed during martial law because it cast doubt on the exploits of certain people who were very powerful in Malacanang or in World War II that in the government at that time. So this is very difficult to find today because it was really virtually destroyed by the martial law regime. But other aspects of the war also came out. And this would include, for example, Muslim-Christian cooperation in Mindanao, in Baclagon's work on the Muslim guerrillas in Mindanao. And then you would have Antonio Tan writing a slim volume on the Chinese during the war. The first time you have a very serious academic work on the role of the Chinese, both as guerrillas and as perceived collaborators. Also rising up in this period now, 40 years after the war, were local histories, which began to show that the war was not a Manila-centric war. It was something that occurred all over the Philippines. So the degrees of impact would vary from place to place. And so the Philippine National Historical Society, which would hold local history conferences around the Philippines, would hold a conference that was focused on the impact of the Japanese occupation on other places in the Philippines. And these were published in a volume that put the papers together, talked about the impact in Mindanao, the experience in the Visayas, and so forth. And this would become very important because you would have national artists, you would have national artist, delivering the keynote speech at this time, and he would bring into question this continuity theory, or whether the war was a watershed. It was a very good summary of what had been written up until that time. And there would now be also new personal accounts coming in the US and in the Philippines, providing different perspectives of the war. Not just the fighting, not just the guerrillas, not just the collaboration side, but what happened immediately after the war and the political turmoil that this brought about. So one very important work was written by Lieutenant Owen. He was a member of the US Counterintelligence Corps, and he arrived here in 1945 to try to examine those cases of collaboration or treason. And he was the first person to really try to document the difficulties in determining who was a traitor, who was not, and so forth. So these were new books coming out in the 1980s. And again, they are still very important works today. So on the left, you see Theodore Friend's Blue-Eyed Enemy. You have Agoncillo's Burden of Proof, Antonio Tan's Chinese in the Philippines, Baclagon's Christian Muslim Guerrillas of Mindanao, the volume of the papers, the proceedings of that 1984 conference on World War II by the Philippine National Historical Society, and William Owen's Eye Deep in Hell, which was the first time that we ever got the glimpse into the difficulty of telling who were traitors and who were not. But the 1990s, we were now moving into 50 years after the war. And by this time, there were even more topics that could be explored: economic policies, religion and propaganda, culture, culture which had really not been given that much attention after Agoncillo's book was published. They would come out in full force by the 1990s, and even more so in the 21st century. You would have another perspective of the war through artworks, which was very powerfully revealed in the artworks, the watercolors of Trudel Dubsky, who was a Swiss national in the Philippines. And to further document the unknown histories of the war was Teresita Maceda, who interviewed Hooks, former Hooks, recorded their music, and published her dissertation as a special book on the music that the Hooks put out during the war, Tinig Mula sa Ibaba. A landmark development in the 1990s was the first time ever that Japanese scholars tried to approach the war from an academic perspective. There were some Japanese who had written about the war as popular articles. A lot of Japanese veterans wrote about their personal accounts. But in the 1990s, this would be the first time that a group of Japanese academics, Japanese scholars, would look into primary sources in Japan and also in the Philippines and in the United States and in Australia as well, to try to come out with new angles, new perspectives, new insights into other aspects of the war. And they also interviewed several surviving Japanese veterans, officials, very key at that time, and they published their work. Unfortunately, the interview transcriptions were never translated into English, but they are still a very major source of information from the Japanese side. There were Japanese documents that were found, and some of these have been made available since. And the forum members would eventually publish a book which highlighted their own research interests. I was the only Filipino member of this, so it was interesting to work. It was the first time that we had a joint Philippine-Japanese academic group to study the war from a more objective perspective. And the work that came out in Japanese was translated into English and was published by Ateneo de Manila University Press, highlighting the amount of material that had been published up to that point, up to 1995, was Morton J. Netzorg's updated bibliography. He had published a bibliography in 1977, but there were so many works that had been excluded from that. So when he updated the work, it came up to be a very thick 2 volumes of a bibliography, which is still underutilized today. And the 1990s being the 50th anniversary of the war, you had several other accounts about the Battle of Manila. The first time that you would have a Filipino writing about the Battle of Manila, this would be Alfonso Aluit's By Sword and by Fire. And then you would have women's narratives. For the first time, comfort women would write about their horrors, the horrific experiences they experienced under the Japanese. And then you would have other Filipino women writing about their experiences during the war. And the political prisoners who were victims of Japan's Kempeitai, particularly Ingles, would write about his own experience as a survivor of the tortures of the Japanese Kempeitai. This is still one of the most painful books to read today, but it really catches in very great detail, painful detail, what it was like to be arrested and tortured by the Japanese Kempeitai. And then filling up the areas that had not fully been accounted for before this particular time was a book on the Sulu Guerrillas by Espaldon. And this was a very exhaustive look using veterans' knowledge, veterans' memories, as well as available documents at that time to really put into very great detail the experiences of the Sulu Guerrillas for the first time. So there was an academic conference held at the Cultural Center of the Philippines in 1992, which commemorated the different aspects of culture during the occupation, whether it be written literature, theater, music, drama, visual arts, and so forth. And the papers of that conference were published in this very important work, Panahon ng Hapon. It's the first time that you really have the Japanese occupation, both from the guerrilla side and the Japanese occupied side, being examined from an artistic perspective by historians and by artists themselves. And one of the important visual works of the war was this pictorial of Trudel Dubsky, Manila 1944-45. Her watercolors, which had a very dramatic catch in them, which had very important sidelights and were one way of examining the war outside of the written word. We talked about the Forum for the Study of the Japanese Occupation of the Philippines, and in the left side here is the book that they published first, the transcription of the interviews of very important people who were still alive at that time. And then in the center is the English translation of the papers that they first translated in Japanese. And then on the right side, we have the book by Teresita Maceda on the music that the Hooks had written and that the Hooks were singing. And the unknown aspects of the war that were coming out, the women's side by Pasita Pestaña Jacinto, very personal diary and account of the war from her point of view, an account by a comfort women in Leyte, the hidden Battle of Leyte, the first real account of the Battle of Manila by a Filipino, by sword and by fire. And at the bottom of this, we see one volume of the very thick and very imposing 2-volume set of the bibliography that Morton Netzer compiled. The other works that I mentioned earlier, these are the works of Gustavo Ingles, the survivor of Japanese torture. The first book really on the comfort women in the Philippines, Comfort Woman by Maria Rosa Henson, and the book by Ernesto Espaldon, who himself was an officer in the Sulu guerrilla movement. But the 21st century, we've moved far enough to further re-examine what happened during the war, but also to go back to the immediacy. And one problem that was coming out, because we were now 50, 60 years away from the war, was that there were a lot of misinterpretations. There was a lot of fake news that was coming out. And so it was important to get back to the primary sources, go back to the eyewitnesses, and the Filipino perspective, of course, was very important. So we would have Legarda's occupation, very important, because he would put in his own experiences as well as the experiences of his friends. So it brought in a very Filipino flavor to the experience of war in the Philippines. Then you would have Ben Cal coming up with Victory at Besang Pass, a result of interviews with surviving veterans at that time. New perspectives would continue to come out. There would be, for example, Frank Ephraim's escape to Manila, which was the first time that the story of the Jews who had escaped the final solution in Europe, who had escaped the death camps in Europe and come to the Philippines, only to encounter the war here. But this was the first time that you read about the war from these Jewish refugees' point of view. And later on, other works would come out to dramatize their own experience. Then you would have more accounts of what was going on outside Manila by local historians. And this is very important because these local histories can only be written by people who are familiar with the ground, people familiar with the area and with the local people. So we would have Mores' Red Sun over Agusan, for example, which is very interesting because we now see the war from this province in Mindanao. And then we have Modesto Saonoy's Against the Rising Sun, which was really about the war in Negros from all sides. And so we were moving away from the Manila-centric accounts. And Japanese accounts would continue to come out, and this would be very important because you would have a recounting of the war, not just by civilians attached to the Japanese military, but this time soldiers themselves. And a very important personal account that was written in Japanese originally and translated into English, published in Iloilo, was Kumai's Mud and Blood in the Philippines, which showed how difficult the life was for a Japanese garrison commander in Iloilo, who was continually under attack by Filipino guerrillas. And then we would have Ishida's Remains of War, who would try to put together the accounts of Japanese veterans and juxtapose them with the accounts of Filipino victims, particularly of the massacres in Laguna and Batangas and so forth. So this was one of those attempts to try to put together both sides that had really wound up hating each other during the war, but he tried to sow understanding, and this would come out in the early 21st century. And then another work that shifted the attention was the compilation of personal accounts by Quintanar and others, entitled Kwentong Bayan, to move away from historical experiences, the battles, the collaboration issue, but would focus on daily life. What was it like to live during the Japanese occupation? What did people eat? What did people enjoy? How did people move around? Transportation they had. These various aspects of daily life brought to light for the first time what it was really like to live during the Japanese occupation. There would be further re-examination of the guerrillas, such as Agustin Baste's work on the guerrillas in Leyte, looking into the conflict between guerrilla factions there and trying to understand why that conflict took place. And there would be other topics that would be explored at this time: transportation and utilities, medicine and science, religion. And since by this time, most of the adults during the war had passed away, you would now have quite a number of stories of children during the war writing about their experiences. This would be different from the works of adults because now they were viewing it from a child's eye. And this would, we still see a number of works coming out that focus on the child's experience, the children's experience during the war. And these are the covers of some of them. Benito Legarda Jr.'s work, 2 volumes first, and come out compiled into one. Kwentong Bayan, which is about daily life during the war. Victory at Besang Pass, the voices of Filipino veterans who were interviewed for this particular book. Red Sun over Agusan, very important because this is now a very important work on what happened in this particular province. And then this work that was critical of some of the guerrillas in Leyte, Heroes, Brigands, and Spies, which brought into attention this very painful memory of friction between different guerrilla factions in Leyte. These are the other works I mentioned earlier. Kumai's Blood and Mud in the Philippines, as a lieutenant who had fought in China, we see the voice of a Japanese officer, not just a civilian attached to the army. And you have Ishida's The Remains of War, which tried to bring in the Filipino and Japanese perspective in one volume. And then Ephraim's Escape to Manila, the Jewish side of the Japanese occupation in the Philippines. There would be lots of local histories. This one in the crucible of an asymmetrical war in Camarines Sur, the Battle of Ising, which was focused in Mindanao, just outside Davao, and then the Bandit Zone, focusing on Negros Oriental, Modesto Saonoy's Against the Rising Sun, 2 volumes, a very comprehensive account of what happened in Negros, the island of Negros. There is a book that I edited, World War II and the Japanese occupation, which tries to bring out the Filipino side from different perspectives, from personal accounts, why Filipinos went to Bataan and fought, why they joined the guerrillas, and also why they collaborated with the Japanese. And so basically, told from first-person accounts, this book tries to bring the Filipino perspective out in front. And then a very rare book, but one that is very important, and unfortunately it's not very well circulated, is a book on what happened to the veterans after the war. So it is Filipino Veterans of World War II, an Endangered Human Species, written by Francisco Cedula, who was himself a veteran, and so the worst of the war, the Death March and so forth. He pioneered in the establishment of veterans groups after the war and fought for veterans' rights up to the time that he passed away. So unfortunately, most of the people in his book, and in fact, Colonel Cedula himself, have gone. So there are several classical personal accounts by veterans. We'll just go through this very quickly. This one on the left side by Jaime Guerrero, Waiting for the Enemy. It's the story of a frontline artillery observer. Mariano Villarin compiled Filipino and American accounts in the United States to come out with a very important work on first-person accounts during the war. General Atienza's A Time for War is, to me, perhaps the most readable account of the Bataan campaign from a Filipino officer's point of view. Dr. Manuel de Vera wrote his memoirs, Doctor in Bataan. So it's not a soldier's perspective, but a doctor in the hospitals. A junior officer, Eliseo Rio, wrote a very classic memoir, Race of a Setting Sun, not only covering the Bataan experiences, but also his joining the guerrillas in Panay Island. And then there is the classic account by the Filipino ace in the Philippine Army Air Corps, Jesus Villamor, They Never Surrendered. So these are among the many, but these are, to me, among the best written works. Of course, there are many more, but these just highlight what the veterans wrote. More recent works have come out. They're about forgotten heroes, what the war was like in different theaters, the experiences of other nationalities. There are more detailed studies based on primary sources by academics, by scholars, by MA students or PhD graduates. And despite the pandemic, books continued to be published. So, for example, The Unknown Heroes, the leper spy, Joey Guerrero, who was working with intelligence and was able to smuggle intelligence in and out Japanese lines. And then we have Odvaha, Courage, about the Czechs in the Philippines, a very unknown story to most people, but there were Czechs who fought in Bataan and who died as prisoners of war. Then a very well-documented and very scholarly approach to the life of General Vicente Lim, Frustrated Ambition by an American military historian, Richard B. Mikesell. There is a revisionist view also, an updated view of Collaboration by August de Viana, called Collaborator. It has been reissued in a much thicker edition. And then for the arts, we would have about movies, Nick Del Campo's Ega, which talks about the movies during and after the war, and very classic work on Cebu. This is a coffee table book full of pictures and personal accounts and a lot of information on Cebu, which was co-edited by Mujares and Bersales and others from Cebu. And of course, very important, also coming out just before the epidemic, just before the pandemic really took root, was James Scott's very authoritative book on the Battle of Manila. It's going to be very difficult to outdo this one. This really used all available sources, and it is to be the classic on the Battle of Manila. And then Desiree Ann Benifayo wrote Honor about her great-grandfather, Jose Abad Santos, in a very engaging style. And just before the pandemic broke out, we would have another very important work on the Makapili by Maria Felisa Sihukotan. During the pandemic, there were at least 3 important books that came out. So 2021 to 2022, there was War and Resistance in the Philippines by an American scholar, PhD scholar, who published his PhD dissertation, which attempted to look at the Filipino guerrilla resistance movement in a thorough, comprehensive manner, using basically secondary sources. So it is American view trying to look at the totality of the resistance movement in the Philippines. And then coming out only last year was Raul Navarro's Musika ng Pananakop, which looks into the musical side of the Japanese occupation and World War II. And the latest book to come out on the war, that was launched only last week, was Guerrilla Days in the Philippine South, 1942 to 1944, 1945, which was co-edited by Colonel Cesar Pobre and myself. And it's this that is the first comprehensive account of the guerrilla resistance movement in Mindanao and Sulu. So there are many others in the works, and they will come out in the next few months or next few years. And while there's so much that has been written about the war, there will still have to be more works because there are so many Japanese sources that have not been utilized. There are still more local sources, traditional sources that we've not fully used. There are primary sources which remain untapped today, particularly because libraries are closed. The People's Court papers, military reports, the Philippine Archives collection of the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office, which fortunately is online and can be accessed by anyone. There are a variety of official sources and many more Japanese sources. Many topics remain unexplored, such as the indigenous people, what happened during the end of the war, how did the war end in the Philippines, the long-term impact of the war still has to be reconsidered, and the story of reconstruction and recovery from the chaos of war is something that has not fully been studied still. Family histories, these have not also fully come out. The Filipino role in the war, the guerrillas and others, slowly have been coming out, but there is much more room for this to continue coming out. And specific aspects of the Japanese occupation, a more detailed study of education, medicine, science, transportation and utilities, the economy, these still are to be covered. Foreigners in the Philippines, the Americans are fairly well covered, but the other different groups, Indians, for example, Italians, the Germans have not fully been covered yet. And today there are fewer eyewitnesses to interview, but there are many undiscovered personal accounts in various houses, in libraries, and so forth. There is room for examining all of this, coming out with new theories and paradigms, but these should not be done separately from groundwork, fieldwork, and basic data. Some academics try to be very theoretical, but in so doing, they distance themselves so much from what actually happened that they create a different world rather than reflect what the actual experience was like. There are many more unpublished book-length manuscripts that have to be discovered and to be published, and there are many works still in progress at this particular time. So at this point, let me end my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and good morning.
Very much, Dr. Jose. We will see you again later for the open forum.
For our second speaker for this morning, we have Dr. Jose Victor de Sena Jimenez from the De La Salle University. Dr. Jose Victor D. Jimenez is OIC Assistant Dean of the External Affairs and Lasallian Mission at De La Salle University, Manila. Dr. Jimenez is an associate professor and former vice chair of the History Department of De La Salle University, where he has been teaching for over 3 decades. He also served as director of the Student Development Office in the same university. Associate Professor Jimenez obtained his Bachelor of Arts in History from De La Salle University and Master of Arts and Doctor of Philosophy, major in the same discipline from the USC Graduate School. Dr. Jimenez is a member of the Phi Gamma Mu International Honor Society in Social Sciences, Philippines Beta Chapter, an associate member of the National Research Council of the Philippines, and a general member of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, National Committee on Historical Research. Associate Professor Jimenez is a lifetime member of the Philippine National Historical Society, Manila Studies Association, Philippine Historical Association, and American Studies Association of the Philippines. Dr. Jimenez is the project director of the annotated compilation of selected Philippine history, primary resources, and secondary works in electronic format under the auspices of the NCCA and CHR. His research interest lies in institutional history. He has written a history of De La Salle University from 1911 to 2012. In the realm of oral history, he supervised an oral history project on the student life at De La Salle University from 1930 to 1945, an oral history, which was founded by De La Salle University Centennial Office and was undertaken by his historical method class from summer 2010 to summer 2012. The project was a modest contribution to the De La Salle Centennial Celebration, heeding the call of administration of the De La Salle University to engage in interdisciplinary research. He served as a co-principal investigator of the project on kahirapan at OFW phenomenon, pagdalumat sa perspektibong multidisciplinary, poverty and OFW phenomenon, conceptualizing from the multidisciplinary perspective, which was founded by the De La Salle University Research Coordination Office. The project involved faculty members from the departments, namely Filipino, Psychology, Theology and Religious Education, and History. Dr. Jimenez has also undertaken other academic endeavors, such as oral history, and interdisciplinary studies and development of online course for economic history in the De La Salle University. He sits on the editorial boards of TALA, an online journal of history, and Philippine Social Science Journal. Once again, Dr. Jose Victor de Sena Jimenez.
I'd like to thank the Philippine Veterans Office for inviting me to the webinar and for giving me the opportunity to talk about the Philippine Constabulary Band. I'd also like to convey my sincere gratitude to Professor Dr. Antonio Hila for allowing me to use his study as a reference for this presentation. Next slide, please. So here's the lecture outline. I shall start with a discussion of music as a strategic tool for colonization of the Philippines. Thereafter, we have music as a tool for pacification during the Spanish period, and then the Philippine Constabulary Band serving the cause of pacification during the American period. Next slide, please. Then it shall be followed by a discussion of the founding of the Philippine Constabulary Band, the biographical sketch of Walter Loving as a conductor. Next slide, please. Performances of the Philippine Constabulary Band, a retirement of Loving in 1916, the band under Loving during the incumbency of Quezon as President of the Commonwealth, and then the reorganization of the band after the war. Okay, next slide, please. Music was employed as a strategic tool for colonization of the Philippines. Music can be dubbed as another weapon of what Reynaldo Eleto calls armory of alien rule. Next slide, please. During the Spanish period, the Spanish missionaries used music as an effective tool for pacification. The missionaries recognized the innate musical talent of the natives. They enhanced such talent by teaching the natives sacred songs to promote the sacred liturgy. Next slide, please. In practically all towns, the church counted on the service of the natives who could read musical notations. They were organized into musical groups to assist in the performance of religious ritual. Next. In 1606, 400 boys recruited from the towns administered by the Franciscans were brought to Lumbang, Laguna, to receive musical instruction and training in instrument making, after which they were sent back to their parishes to teach other children. Next. The creation of an auxiliary band composed of natives to assist the colonial bureaucracy was a move calculated to bring about efficiency and economy. Next. This was utilized during the American occupation of the Philippines and was particularly gleaned in the Ordinance of July 18, 1901, which sought the establishment of the Philippine Constabulary PC, the mother unit of the PC Band. Next. The establishment of the PC Band, to some extent, had served the cause of pacification during the initial years of the American period. Next. The PC was created at a time when continued military campaign in the Philippines was perceived to create a catastrophic effect on the political career of President William McKinley, who was then seeking re-election in 1900. Next. The American public had become hostile to sending more troops to the Philippines because of the drain the war created on the budget, amounting to $75 million annually. With the deployment of 70,000 American soldiers in the archipelago, the McKinley administration impressed upon the minds of the American public that peace had already been finally achieved in the entire archipelago. Next. On July 4, 1901, the military regime came to an end and was replaced by a civil government headed by William Howard Taft, even as resistance was still being waged in the countryside. Next. As a result, the American public welcomed some 25,000 Army soldiers back home, a development that somehow lessened the American public's suspicion of a continued military campaign, as there were still some 50,000 American soldiers in the Philippine bush. Next. The establishment of the civil government entailed that peace had already been instituted and the Filipinos had eventually accepted American colonization. The creation of the civil government was perceived as a respite on the part of the McKinley's government to ask for big budgetary allocation from Congress for the continuance of military campaign in the Philippines. Next. Pacification became the order of the day, and the discontinuance of the military government was seen to greatly hasten it. Commissioner Luke B. Wright proposed its establishment as embodied in Organic Act number 175 on July 18, 1901. Less than a month later, on August 8, the Philippine Constabulary came into being. Its function was to maintain peace, law and order, and to suppress crime. Next. More than a year after its first anniversary, the need for band music to assist in military ceremonies as well as civil and official functions was strongly felt in the Philippine Constabulary. Colonel Henry Allen, then chief of the Philippine Constabulary, wanted to have a band under his command. Next. Governor Taft has been credited for the formation of the band. While attending a fiesta at San Fernando, La Union, Taft was impressed by the beautiful rendition of a chorus made up of 400 voices. This was the 48th Regimental Chorus and Band conducted by Loving. Next. Taft was convinced that the Philippines should have a national band, a counterpart of the United States Marine Corps Band. Taft told Loving that when he would become civil governor, he would have band organized and Loving would be its conductor. Next. Loving, an African-American, was born in Lovingstone, Virginia on December 17, 1872. He attended the public schools of the District of Columbia and St. Paul, Minnesota. He started singing a church choir when he was 16 and soon after became its leader. Next. Loving later on became a member of the noted Temperance Choir of Washington. A gifted and active graduate of the New Conservatory, he joined the Army on June 23, 1893, at age 21 as a cornetist in the 24th Infantry Regiment Band at New Mexico. Next. Then Loving was detailed to the 48th Regiment Band, U.S. Volunteer Infantry Color, led on September 23, 1899. He held the rank of private when he was discharged. By then, He had studied violin and saxophone. He would eventually learn playing all the woodwind instruments. Next. On August 8, 1898, Loving returned to military service, this time with the 6th Regiment U.S. Volunteer Infantry Colored, stationed at Fort Thomas, Kentucky as chief musician. After his enlistment, he enrolled at the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston, Massachusetts, and studied harmony, conducting, and playing the cornet. Next. Hoping to become a bandmaster, he re-enlisted in the Army and was assigned to the 48th Regiment Band. When the 48th Regiment Band was ordered to go to the Philippines, Loving was immediately promoted to chief musician. The unit arrived in the Philippines in 1900. Next. There are some 6,000 African American soldiers distributed among army posts throughout the archipelago. It was generally believed that African Americans were more cordial than white soldiers. In fact, the Negrito troops were reputed to have good behavior, which won them praise from diverse quarters. Next. The Filipinos regarded them not as Americans but as Negritos because of the color of their skin. The fear and awe that the Filipinos initially had soon vanished. They quickly turned their fear into friendliness and their awe into admiration. Next. The Filipinos came to regard them as very much like ourselves, only larger, and gave them affectionate appellation, Negritos Americanos. These African American soldiers reciprocated such a goodwill of the peaceful natives and treated with consideration and respect. Next. 6 feet and 1 inch tall, Loving was well loved and respected as a conductor, not only by Filipino musicians of the band, but by the general public as well. Next. He imposed quality standards for the band, and the average Filipino musicians who played under him, after passing a rigorous audition, developed under his guidance into accomplished musicians, able to play several instruments and talk entertainingly and intelligently on the eccentricities of the different composers. Next. Loving took in only the best Filipino musicians. Of some 300 clarinet players who auditioned, he would get only 8. Of the 28 French horn players, he would choose only 2. His ability to make the band sound symphonic, despite the fact that most of his musicians were of soloist caliber, was greatly admired. Next. Loving lavished his musicians with gifts of cash, musical instruments, and barrels of beer whenever the occasion called for it. After a good performance, he would declare the following day a holiday. Next. Oral accounts had it that he rehearsed the band for 8 hours a day. As his credentials would attest, Loving was more than qualified to assume the position of conductor of the band, and the musicians were likely to play under his tutelage. Next. George Malcolm described him as a black American with exceptional talent. Judge Plandran, on the other hand, spoke of him, saying that his qualifications are thoroughly gentlemanly deportment, a fine soldier physique, a remarkably good education, very attractive manners and excellent personal habits and morals, and a thorough knowledge of Spanish, which language he speaks, reads, and writes fluently. Next. Loving was regarded as a soloist. His ability to wield the baton to his personality and eloquently grasp the intention of the composer spelled the hallmark of his artistry. He would tell the musicians, "Forget yourselves, only the music matters." Next. In December 4 of 1902, the performance of the PC band was played up in the newspaper, although the outfit was referred to as an orchestra, not a band. It played a memorial service held at the Manila Elks Club. Its program included the overture from Cavalleria Rusticana by Mascagni, the Andante from Wagner's Lohengrin, and the Petit Suite by Bizet. 6 days later, a report about sending Philippine orchestra that would specially demonstrate an inborn native talent at the exposition came out in the papers. Undoubtedly, the orchestra referred to here was the PC band, for the terms orchestra and band were then interchangeably used in the West. And even up to now, the practice continues. The performance of the band in a past review to welcome Vice Governor Luke Wright on April 30 was 1903 was noted on the following account. The music of the military bands was excellent, as it always is, but the constabulary band, with a full complement of pieces, their neat appearance in their uniforms, and the style of their rendition under the leadership of Walter Loving, certainly had the hearts of their listeners. Okay, so April 30. 2 days later, the newspaper carried an announcement about the band's concert at 8:30 in the evening of the same day of the Binondo Square, then known as Plaza Calderon de la Barca, in front of Binondo Church. The program consisted of the following: General Tanner March, Overture Hangadi Laszlo by Erkel, solo baritone scenes that are brightest, Mac Onofre soloist, round, Jota Gigante Acabitudos by Caballero, waltzes La Serenata by Hoxon, selections from Lohengrin by Wagner and Star Spangled Banner. It was customary for the band then to end the concert with the U.S. anthem, the Star Spangled Banner. The band regularly performed on this venue on Saturdays, at times on a Monday at the Luneta. One thing was sure: as Dr. Hila put it, the band rarely repeated the programs it played. It simply meant that it had mastered quite a vast repertoire. And soon, the public eagerly anticipated its free concerts. Indeed, in only a few months, it had become popular. In May of 1903, the municipal government increased its grant to the band from $50 gold to $200 Mexican per month in recognition of its excellent work and high popularity with the public. The money was spent on the repair and maintenance of the instruments and on the transportation of the band members. On June 22 of the same year, in connection with the band's slated concert at the Luneta, the public was allowed to make requests for pieces to be played. Of the 6 requested pieces, the overture to the Philippine opera La Alianza Soñada or Sandugong Panaginip, Dreamed Alliance by Ladislao Bonus, music, and Pedro Paterno, libretto, which had been premiered in August the year before at the Surilla Theater, topped the list with 263 requests. Loving had the opera translated into English from the Spanish text in 1902. Another Philippine piece, Aires Filipinas, arranged by a certain Ruiz, followed with 131 requests. Then came Richaldi's Carnival of Venice with 89 and Rossini's Semiramide Overture with 81. 2 marches by Sosa, Hands Across the Sea and Stars and Stripes Forever, occupied the last slot with 13 requests each. Regretfully, the band could not perform the overture to La Alianza Soñada because the music was incomplete and therefore an arrangement could not be made. Okay, next please. A request was also made earlier in February for the band to appear more often at the Binondo Square and to set certain nights aside for light concerts at 8 o'clock or 8:30 p.m. to give undoubted gratification to many music-loving people who are unable to attend concerts earlier in the evening, which was usually held at 6. The band was praised, for rendering excellent concerts for the benefit of the public under the leadership of Mr. Lovering. I think it's an error, no? Okay. It must be pointed out that listening to the band was then, as it is now, an integral part of the musical cultural life of the Filipino people. Attendance at concerts or simply watching local bands perform has been a favorite Philippine pastime, especially during fiestas as well as in other social, civic, and religious celebrations. Dr. Hila also noted that the band's existence in the Philippines can be traced back to the Spanish colonial period when various regimental or military bands were organized in the late 18th century. They were usually composed of woodwinds, brasses, and percussions. The organization of civilian bands, patterned after the military band, eventually followed. An immense tradition, therefore, of band music is widely noted all over the country. In fact, some of the musicians of Loving came from the bands of the immediate Spanish colonial era, and Loving himself would go from place to place to recruit the best musicians he could find. It can be gleaned, therefore, that the PC band was not only a marching band, providing music on the parade or fostering camaraderie or esprit de corps in the organization, but more importantly, it projected a wholesome public image of the Philippine Constabulary and, more significantly, the new political dispensation. It was felt that listening to the bouncy strains and the beautiful band music would somehow alleviate the pain of the wounds the war had inflicted on the people. It was already the time for peace and cooperation, and even the men in khaki and red, who carried the brunt of the collective campaign for pacification, had become a figure of dignity, receiving tremendous admiration for the maintenance of law and order, which, in the words of Dean Worcester, had never been equaled or approached in the history of the islands. The band gained much recognition when it was chosen to play at the St. Louis Exposition. On May 20, a press notice appeared announcing its concert, slated at 8:30 in the evening at the Binondo Square in honor of William P. Wilson and Gustave Niederlane of the St. Louis Exposition Board. At 6:15 in the evening of the same day, the 30th Infantry Band, another military band presumably of the U.S. Army that actively held concerts at Toleneta, was also slated to perform. From the 7 numbers that Loving's band usually gave, the announcement contained 9 this time. Loving had honored the 2 officials with more pleasurable listening. The following morning, the Manila Times bannered the announcement of the choice of the PC band to perform at the St. Louis Exposition. The concert the previous evening had been hailed as one of the best entertainments of the series of these delightful events with which this popular band has been pleasing the public. The program was lauded as exceptionally excellent, and Loving's directorship fully demonstrated his ability as a leader. In his remarks to the 42 musicians of the band, Wilson said that he would ask Governor Taft that it be sent to the exposition with increased members, as there were millions in the United States who would have been proud of the opportunity to hear what I have heard tonight. The full text of his remarks reads, "I want to say that I have listened attentively and with much pleasure for the past hour and a half, and have enjoyed the music you have produced, and am much surprised and gratified at the musical talents which you possess. I repeat that I am much pleased with the music of this evening, and want to say to you that I am about to ask the civil governor to allow you to be sent to the U.S. to participate in the Grand Exposition of St. Louis, which is to take place there in 1904. You, here tonight, are a musical people. Your talent is marked, and you must bear in mind that success can only be attained first through natural talent and genius, which you have, and secondly, through diligent practice. There are millions of people in the United States who will have been proud to hear what I have heard tonight, and I hope to hear this band many times more with augmented numbers, playing at the Grand Exposition of St. Louis. I am soon to leave for the United States, but when I do, I will not say goodbye, but hasta la otra vista." What Dr. Wilson said about innate talent being honed by diligent practice to achieve success hints at the persuasive component of pacification that was hidden in the establishment with the PC band. In the final analysis, innate talent or genius alone is not enough to achieve artistic greatness. Its honing through diligent practice implies a competent mentor that admittedly was sorely lacking among the native musicians, and that role was perfectly assumed by Walter H. Loving, who provided both direction and overall artistic personality to the band. An environment conducive to the fusion of sound mentorship and native talent was likewise needed. Its attainment was possible only under the blessing of peace. It was utterly an impossibility to see the PC band rise to greatness under the grim shadow of war. By July, Philippine Constabulary Chief General Henry Allen had allowed the band to participate in the exposition, saying that 80 musicians would go at the expense of the Insular Constabulary. Niederlane, on the other hand, said he promised the St. Louis people a handsome Filipino band of about 80 pieces. When the final list was made, the band consisted of 84 musicians all in all. Next, please. Of course, Governor Taft, who played Big Brother to the Filipinos and whose heart went to those people with a possible yearning for a reciprocal regard, liked the idea very much. She was quoted to have said that the band musicians represented the 7 million of the most interesting, more progressive, and most misunderstood people in the world, who are stereotyped as half-naked savages. He appealed to the public to let the band go, as they hated to part with their favorite band that had been a regular source of popular joy. Taft himself was then preparing to leave for the U.S. to assume the post of the Secretary of War. Letting the band participate in the exposition was precisely an opportunity to let the U.S. and the world know that peace had indeed been established in the island. So remember in the previous discussion, we said that the PC band had served the cause of pacification in the country. And through the spirit of the white man's burden, the PC band was formed as an example of artistic fusion and collaboration, possibly only with the acceptance of the new political order that carried with it an effective transformative dimension. From September 1903 to the early months of 1904, there were no announcements of the band's concerts either at the Luneta or Binondo Square. So it may be safe to assume that the band was seriously preparing to the hilt for its participation in the exposition. On March 12, 1904, the band sailed for the U.S. When President Roosevelt pushed the button to signal the opening of the exposition on April 30, an estimated crowd of 400,000 spectators from all over the world, civilized and uncivilized, were on hand. At the plaza, the Whale and Salsa bands played. Their program included the Exposition Hymn and the Louisiana Exposition March. In early May, the PC band became the toast of audience when it played in total darkness one evening in a competition. When the members went on stage, the audience could hardly believe that a band from a remote possession of the U.S. could play alongside with seasonal bands from America and Europe, such as the UN Marine Corps Band and the John Philip Sousa Band, the Mexican National Band, the Band of the British Grenadier Guards, the Royal Italian Band, and of course this Band of France, the Le Garde Republican Band of France. It had just started playing the opening bars of Rossini's William Tell Overture when the power went out. Pausing for a while, Loving instinctively tied his white handkerchief to the end of the baton and continued waving it like a magic wand, cueing the musicians accurately. They did not miss a single note nor mar any rhythmic passage. The power outage lasted for an entire hour, and Loving and his band continued playing in the dark until the entire program was done. The handkerchief that floated in the air was the only visible thing on stage. It was insinuated that the incident was intentionally made to embarrass Loving and the Filipinos, but the whole thing turned favorably for the band. For when the lights went on again, Loving and his little brown men became world celebrities. It was not just playing in the dark, however. Next slide, please. It was not just playing in the dark, however, that made the band famous. It was acclaimed for its members' pure musicianship and the soulfulness with which they enter into the idiosyncrasies of each individual composer. Loving, on the other hand, got a rave from E.A. Lefebvre, a respected critic of the time and a soloist of the famous Gilmore Band. He said, "He leads and as an artistic musician should, and his conception of operatic selections is simply fine. The band performs the works of the great composers with perfect expression, and their leader is always sure in keeping them in the right tempos." Another thing in which the band and the leader remind me of the Gilmore organization is in the introduction of surprise features and novelties, which never fail to please. The band bagged a major prize, second only to the Band of France. Okay? When they were presented to Taft, the latter flushed with pride and promised that he would become President of the United States. He would send for it to grace his inauguration. Before returning to the Philippines, Loving wrote General Allen requesting permission for the band, which had made much progress and required much reputation. For the band, which had made such progress and required much reputation, to tour the U.S. after the close of the fair. The band was in fact booked to play outside St. Louis, such as in the International Conclave of the Knights of Pieties at Louisville, Kentucky on August 16, and at the Wisconsin State Fair on September 5 and 6. The band was listed among the best at the exposition, if not the best. The request was immediately granted. While it was winning accolades abroad, its mother unit, the Philippine Constabulary, was also successful in projecting its image as a pursuer of peace. Its battle cry, "outnumbered but never outfought," was pursued to the hilt, so that by 1904, military rule was completely lifted in Luzon and the Visayas, even as pocket resistance continued. Inspired by Victor Herbert Orchestra and the German Symphony Orchestra at the fair, when the band arrived home, Loving trained his men to double as an orchestra, all with ease. Taft granted Loving's request to equip the band with string instruments. By the time Taft returned to inaugurate the first Philippine Assembly in 1908, he had the pleasure of listening to the band as it shifted to being an orchestra, with exchange of instruments done during the interval. The PC Band made its second visit to the U.S. at Taft's inauguration. The band accompanied him in the inaugural parade from the White House to the Capitol, where he would take his oath of office. Traditionally, the honor of escorting the elected president belonged to the U.S. Marine Band. The PC Band was also invited to play alternately with the U.S. Marine Band at the reception. It was the only band outside the U.S. that was given such a singular honor. The PC Band earned the reputation of being the president's own, a phrase coined by President Thomas Jefferson to refer to the U.S. Marine Band that played during his inauguration. The PC Band was by then composed of 86 musicians and boasted no fewer than 22 soloists. It had mastered almost 1,000 pieces, many of which were committed to memory. It amassed a series of firsts in the U.S. It was the first non-American band to lead the president's inaugural parade, the first non-American orchestra to play at the White House for the president's first official public reception, and the first band to perform at the new Riverside Bandstand in Washington. Next slide, please. From Washington, the band proceeded to fulfill engagements in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Philadelphia, Atlantic City, New Jersey, and Seattle. Its week-long engagement in Atlantic City was extended to 4 months, and the American audience that included artists from all over marveled at the band's ease to transpose at sight latest music hits of the season. The band could have stayed longer, but the Philippine government ordered it to proceed to the shuttle fair to greet President Taft, who was there in September. By early October, the band embarked for the Philippines. In 1911, Loving represented the Philippines in a conclave in Italy, where he stayed for 18 months. He also did research in connection with his desire to establish a conservatory of music in the Philippines. When he returned to the country, however, his time was taken up by retraining the band that had deteriorated during his absence. He had also to prepare it for a trip to San Francisco to participate in the Panama Pacific Exposition. His dream, therefore, to put up a conservatory of music did not materialize. With his newly gained knowledge, he prepared the band once more, going through a set of 120 programs, 10 numbers, each without repeating a single piece. Practically all the 1,200 pieces had to be committed to memory. Tough competition awaited Loving at San Francisco. There were the famous bands, the Tavius Band, the Boston Municipal Band, the Chicago Band, Creators Band, Ines Band, and the Exposition Band under the baton of the prominent Italian conductor, Professor Casaza. The Manila Times ran an editorial boasting that Loving's men would make Sosa's pets look like a bunch of amateurs. On the way to the exposition, the band played in Hong Kong, Shanghai, Yokohama, Kobe, and Honolulu, and won the admiration of their listeners. Next slide, please. At the exposition, Sosa, who had the opportunity to conduct the band, ranked it the best and organized among those that played. He said, "When I closed my eyes, I thought it was the U.S. Marine Band playing." Sergeant Pedro V. Navarro conducted the band in the interim when Loving was recuperating after it was found out that he had tuberculosis. Impressed with the skill of Navarro as conductor, Sosa called him "my friend, my little brown brother." While Loving was convalescing, there was a move to scrap Loving's name as a conductor of the band, but his loyal musicians would not allow it. The band received the highest honors, and Loving was awarded a gold diamond-studded coat of arms. Manuel L. Quezon, who was then the resident commissioner to Washington, D.C., sought Sergeant Navarro out and shook his hand for a job well done, saying in eloquent Spanish, "I heard a great deal about you and your band in Washington. I'm greatly delighted to know that under your baton, we have a band that can stand side by side with the best they have in the exposition. As soon as I get back to the Philippines, I shall see to it that you get your just reward." When the band got back to the Philippines, Navarro was promoted to third lieutenant. On February, next slide please, on February 15, next slide please. On February 15, 1916, Loving requested retirement for health reasons at the age of 44. In a concert at the Luneta, which was billed as the last, he passed on the baton to Navarro, his own recruit, while the band was playing the final piece, Auld Lang Syne. Navarro finished conducting it. In a tired voice, Loving gave his valedictory, paying tribute to the musical talent of the Filipinos and enjoining all to support Navarro. The gesture could not have been more fitting and relevant to the time, as the spirit of Filipinization, or the gradual withdrawal of the Americans in favor of the Filipinos in the colonial government, was at its height. Born on June 29, 1879, Pedro Navarro hailed from Tagudin, Ilocos Sur, studied under Maestro Marcelo Adonay from 1894 to 1898, and Jose Maslova, a Spanish violin teacher. In 1899, he joined the U.S. Volunteer Band. Loving heard him play with the U.S. Army 6th Artillery Band and succeeded in recruiting him, assuring the latter of better opportunities in the PC Band, even if he had better pay and privileges in his former unit. Apart from the clarinet, Navarro could play 2 or 3 others, but had no formal training, musical training, like most of the band's musicians. His stint as conductor of the PC Band lasted only for a year, as he retired in 1917 and joined the PC as a professional soldier. Conrado de la Cruz, his student in violin, regarded him as a seasoned and accomplished violinist, apart from being a piccolo player. He was a soloist both on clarinet and piccolo. Lieutenant Jose Silos succeeded Navarro. After a year, he also retired. So with the retirement of Navarro and Silos, the band was in a bad state again. Quezon sought Loving out once more and urged him to reorganize the band. Loving rushed back to Manila and found the band a trifle better than ordinary street band. The better players had left it. Loving put the band back to its former shape and this time developed a protege, Alfonso Presnido, who would eventually take his place. Presnido was sent to study at the Dana Musical Institute in Warren, Ohio. Loving stayed on as conductor until Presnido came back in 1923 to assume the directorship of the band. In 1938, Loving was again recalled by Quezon, who was now president of the Commonwealth government, to prepare the band once more to put back the Loving touch for its participation in the Golden Gate Exposition in 1939. Quezon offered him the rank of lieutenant colonel and the office of advisor to the president. All through the years, Loving had become close to Quezon. Loving composed a collectivista march and dedicated it to Quezon. It was played by the band in a concert at the Luneta, with Presnido conducting on August 16, 1928, 3 days before Quezon's birthday. Old-timers came back to the band and new musicians were admitted. The band's musician was increased from 90 to 100. A complete set of new instruments was purchased, the finest the money could buy, and new uniforms were ordered. Big work awaited Loving as the band would have to rely mostly on new recruits. The original 42 members of the 1902 batch were all gone. Of the 90 men who joined the 1909 sojourn in the U.S., only 2 were active, Surgeons Daniel Pajardo and Restituto de Leon, and of the batch that went to the Panama Pacific Exposition, 11 were still active, including Presnido. Presnido, now a captain, assisted Loving in preparing the band for the exposition. At the exposition's also successor, Frank Goldman, was unimpressed with the ability of the band. However, when the band played at first sight, next slide please. Okay. When the band played at first sight, his composition, the Golden Gate March, perfectly, he changed his attitude. In admiration, he gave more pieces for the band to play, and all the more he was convinced of its sterling ability. And when he came to Manila during the liberation, he conducted the same band to his delight. To vary the band's program, Loving had to rush to local music stores to purchase pieces that he would give the musicians to play at first sight. First sighters as they were, they played and rehearsed pieces handsomely to Loving's satisfaction. For their sterling performance, the band won the second prize at the exposition. When the war broke out, the band was disorganized. Loving and his wife were incarcerated at the University of Santo Tomas for 3 years and 3 months. In the solitude of his imprisonment, Loving celebrated his abiding faith and pride in the country where he lived the most fruitful years of his life in a composition he wrote, Our Beloved Philippines. In the words of his wife, Edith Loving, he saw the country he loved being desecrated by the Japanese, and so he was inspired to write Our Beloved Philippines. The plea of Manila's prominent citizens that the couple be granted parole allowed them to return to their apartment in Ermita. A Japanese soldier who had gone berserk during the liberation of Manila in February 1945 beheaded Loving at the Luneta, ironically the site of his greatness, where he and the band gave the best performances that made them famous. The lines of Beloved Philippines are as follows. All hail to the Philippines, the land of enchanting scenes. We proudly share your beauty rare, beloved Philippines. Your rivers and mountain chains, your treasure and fertile plains with love. We raise our voice in praise, beloved Philippines. For human dignity, for clean, unselfish hands, for righteousness and freedom, our noble republic stands. Like our fathers, brave and true, we know what our freedom means. We'll fight for you. We'll die for you, beloved Philippines. In 1945, Major General Basilio Valdez, then Secretary of National Defense, ordered the organization of the band, assigning Lieutenant Antonio Buenaventura to the task. Buenaventura, who was then a budding composer and conductor, was able to gather 98 original members of the band. In 1938, he had composed Echoes from the Philippines on the request of Loving for it to be played at the Golden Gate Exposition. Under his guidance and with the zeal fired by 4 decades of glorious tradition, the band bounced back to life. However, because the Philippine Constabulary had not been reactivated yet, the band was placed under the Philippine Army, with Buenaventura handling it for 16 years. On October 15, 1974, next slide please, when the PA Band gave its anniversary concert at the CCP with Captain Jose Francisco Dunca Jr., the band's commanding officer as conductor, it honored Loving, its founding conductor. As a tribute to Loving, the surviving members of the PC Band put up the Colonel Walter H. Loving Memorial Society. Some 45 original members graced the occasion, led by no less than Loving's widow, Mrs. Edith Loving, who was known as the mother of the PC Band. The preamble of the Constitution of the Society, as printed in the program, idolized Loving for the glory he had brought to the country through the band. It reads, "We, the original surviving members of the pre-war Philippine Constabulary Band, in order to perpetuate the memory of its founder, Colonel Walter H. Loving, who unselfishly shared with us his sense of musical artistry and under whose direction the Philippine Constabulary had earned plaudits from noted foreign bandmasters and critics when it played, among others, in international engagements such as the St. Louis Exposition in 1904, the inauguration of William H. Taft as President of the USA in 1909, Panama Canal Exposition in 1915, and Golden Gate Exposition in 1939, thereby affording recognition to the innate physical talent of the Filipinos and bringing highest honors in the Philippines, whom he loved as his own. With the creation of the Philippine National Police to replace the Philippine Constabulary, the Philippine National Police Band, with its headquarters at Camp Crame, also honored Loving and the original PC Band in its concerts. One such concert was held last October 15, 2002, marking its centennial anniversary under the command of its conductor, Police Chief Inspector Gilbert M. Ramos, PNP. Next slide, please. Okay, so by way of summing up, the PC band is gone, and the feat it had achieved cannot be duplicated. But its memory is still glorified today by the military bands that recognize its outstanding accomplishments. It had served as shining inspiration to most of them. Next slide, please. From a marching band, the PC band metamorphosed into a symphonic band of a sterling quality. It did not take long for it to be noticed and raved about by many, Filipinos and foreigners alike. From the parade grounds where it provided music during military ceremonies in the trying years of pacification, it was transported to foreign grounds on not one but 4 different occasions, conveying the message of goodwill and understanding, at the same time projecting the Filipinos' innate musical ability honed to perfection by its African-American mentor Walter H. Loving. Loving did not only become close to the Filipinos, but like them, he loved the Philippines very much. Next slide, please. Through the years, when peace finally reigned in the islands after passing through the ordeal of pacification, which needed establishment of the Philippine Constabulary, the mother unit of the band, it worked even harder to reap more accolades. There was close rapport between the Filipino musicians and their tutor, Colonel Walter H. Loving, inspired by a mutual quest for making excellent band music. Next slide, please. Loving, aware of the stout tradition of band music that existed in the country, and given the innate ability of the Filipino musician, simply had to give his best, and the best he indeed gave. For the musicians, learning was full and meaningful as it was done in the most conducive manner, where a conscious effort for the learning was propelled by a peaceful atmosphere that pervaded a greater part of the colonial period under the Americans, all done in spreading the white man's burden. Next slide, please. Loving keenly organized the great potential of the Filipino musicians that awaited transformation. The musicians in turn were eager to benefit from the expertise of Loving. It is therefore incorrect to say that the band was just a mere result of the American occupation of the country. Next slide, please. While its establishment to some extent had served the cause of pacification during the initial years of the American period, eventually it became a collaborative undertaking between the Filipino musicians and Loving to make nothing but a fine symphonic band that enriched Philippine band music in general. Truly, the band music is a lasting legacy that until today continues to be an integral part of the country's music, cultural, living tradition. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jimenez.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, this is where our morning session ends. The afternoon session will proceed at exactly 1 p.m. While waiting, let us give you a virtual tour of our national military shrines.